Hello everybody, this is Randy Klepetska with the Farmer Supply Association Agri Report. Well, it's wet. I mean, there's no need in talking much about it, to be honest with you. I don't need to belabor the point, of what we've been through since really early April. So let's just get on to the topics I want to talk about this week, and we're going to be talking about stuff related to the rain, but we're not going to get into any more detail about what's been going on. Questions I've been getting, so far or recently. Number one, how late can I plant rice? We're getting late into the planting season. We planted, this field here was planted on March the 21st, probably the earliest field I know of planted in Jackson County. And, now we're looking at May the 23rd, more than 2 months after that, and still got people wanting to plant rice, probably the most unplanted rice I can remember at this time of the year. So I've been getting that question, how late can I plant rice? The bottom line, my first response is always, how bad do you want to plant rice? How bad do you need to plant rice? We've got some time to plant rice. The yields are going to be going downhill, but we've still got time to plant rice. The short answer is probably around June 1st. We can go later than that, but that's kind of, if you just want to go for one date, that's kind of my go-to date right there, although we can certainly plant later than that. I got some data from a planting date study conducted over at the new experiment station between Harrisburg and Jonesboro. This is last year's data. It's going to be different every year. It's one location, 1 year. So remember that. But I want to just talk to you about that data. It's a good example. I think it's good data. Looking at 3 different varieties, 2 planting dates. There were actually more planting dates than that at this study, but I'm going to just mention 2. One's the April 3rd planting date, because that's prime time. That's, your probably an optimum planting time right around that early part of April. The other one is June 5th, because that's, when a lot of people are going to be thinking about cutting off if they haven't already. So we're going to look at that optimum versus that late and see the yield difference at that test. Looking at 3 different varieties, Ozark, the conventional variety, planted on April 3rd last year, 202 bushels per acre. You go to that June 5th planting date, it's 172 bushels per acre, so 30 bushels less. Looking at CLL18, April 3rd, 206 bushels per acre. June 5th, 154 bushels per acre, 52 bushels less. Looking at the hybrids, Rice Tech 7302, 214 bushels per acre. June 5th, 202 bushels per acre, so 12 bushels difference there. So as we always say, the hybrids tend to hold up better to those late plantings than the conventional varieties. So, if you're having to plant late, look towards a hybrid. I think is going to be your most consistent choice. Not saying some of the other varieties can't do well, but consistently those hybrids hold up longer if you can get the seed. So again, let's look at around June 1st, give or take a little bit is our cutoff date if you're wanting, if you're looking at that right now. Also back at that test, I just want to talk about the average of all the varieties. On April the 3rd, the average among all varieties was 192 bushels per acre, and on June 5th is 165 bushels per acre. So 27 bushels between those 2 dates if you just look at the old test. So again, let's start looking around. You're still wanting to plant rice. June 1st is a good day to think about. It's not to say you can't go later. We used to plant rice behind wheat in Jackson County. So, that would be mid-June. And we'd have, yields, back in those days, maybe 120 bushels per acre on a good year. So, we could certainly make rice later. It's just how much. And with the economics the way it is, you need bushels. Question number 2, let's talk about fertilizer. Looking at pre-flood fertilizer in these conditions, the wet conditions that we're facing just almost continuously. Several things you need to look at on how to efficiently manage that fertilizer, because our best way is on dry ground. The first thing you need to do when thinking about fertilizer dates, I think, is or when to stop or when to get it out by, you need to look at how long you've got. The best way to determine this, how long you've got before your yield starts dropping off, is to run a DD50 on these particular fields. I know DD50 is not popular anymore for a lot of people. A lot of people probably haven't seen one in years, maybe decades. But there's one date on that DD50, and that's the final recommended time to apply your pre-flood nitrogen if it's not optimum conditions. And it's a very good date on there. If you don't use the DD50 for any other thing than that, I think it's good to have it for. And another thing on the DD50, it's so easy to run these anymore. It's not like in the 70s and 80s when you had to fill out a card, take it to your extension office, they ran it in their computer when they had time. and then they mailed it to you, you might have, multiple week turnaround to get those results. Now you can do that on your phone and literally, and I mean literally, get your results in less than a minute. If you've got that program set up, I ran some this morning and it was probably less than a minute to run those DD50. So it's very easy. You can do it on your phone at your convenience. So keep that in mind, because it'll tell you that last date. And at that point, the yields start dropping off pretty quickly. It's not instantly, it's a few days, but they'll start dropping pretty quickly after that date. So keep that in mind. Once you've got that date, let's try to get dry conditions. I'm talking about white dry, or at least point where mud doesn't stick on the bottom of your boots. Let's try to get those conditions and get that fertilizer out on those kind of conditions, and then get flooded up as quickly as we can. That's the ideal situation. So get that date, get dry by that date, and hopefully get the fertilizer out and then water it in. Just looking at some example DD50s and that date, looking at rice that emerged on April 7th. This was some of our earlier, like this field right here would have emerged probably on April 7th. Looking at that date on those, had emergence date, Ozark 531, Clearfield 18, 531, the hybrid Rice Tech 7302, 525. So that's coming up Sunday. So again, that's the end date where you want to have something done by. So we're getting right there, especially on something on the hybrids. Now, our main planting window in this area was like the week of April 14th for a period after that. So I took an emergence date of April the 25th, and the final recommended time to apply nitrogen in those cases where it emerged on April 25th was June 9th. That was on Ozark, also June 9th on Clearfield 18. And for the hybrid Rice Tech 7302, 6-3, June 3rd was the last date. So again, still got some time, especially on this where the majority of the rice emerged. That very earliest stuff, we're getting right there. But that other stuff that was planted in mid-April and later, we still got some time on. So again, try to get it on dry ground. If not, if it looks like it might be fixing to dry out, but there's still, it's still a little wet and you think it's going to dry out, well then put that fertilizer out on wet ground and let it dry before you before you turn the well on. The whole goal is to try to get that fertilizer incorporated into the ground. So, if you do put it out in that situation, let it dry some. That way when you put the flood on, it'll be incorporated into the ground. The next choice, if it looks like it's not going to get dry, it's going to stay wet, and it looks like we may be getting into some of that, then we start thinking about spoon feeding. And spoon feeding, I mean 100 pounds about every 7 days, maybe back that up to 5 days, but generally every 7 days, let's get a 100-pound shot of fertilizer out there and just spoon feed it every 7 days. Usually about 3 you'll get this. That'll get you 300 pounds of urea. Normally we're putting out about 250 or so. So it's going to take more urea to get enough nitrogen efficiency here, but at least you'll get it out there in a decent situation. So that would be the next choice. So we go from putting it out on dry ground, maybe putting it out a little wet if you have to, and letting it dry out if it will dry out before you turn your well on. And the third choice would be spoon feeding. Another thing I want to look at is, we've got fields out there with no levees out in them. And in this case, basically you're going to have to spoon feed, put the first one out on dry ground in front of a rain, hopefully, and let it get incorporated into the ground, and then wait another week and see your conditions. Maybe you're going to get another rain. Maybe you get dry enough you can put the levees up. But again, I call it a modified spoon feeding approach. That's when you have no levees. And there's plenty of those fields out there this year, so they have to be handled a little bit differently. So if you got any questions on how to fertilize in your situation, just feel free to contact me and I'll be glad to help you out on that. Last thing is weed control. I think the weed control is looking a lot better than I thought it was going to look. Back last weekend, I was fixed to look at a lot of rice that I've been looking at semi-rarely, and I was fearful that I was going to see a lot of grown-up messes. Fortunately, I've seen very few grown-up messes. The residuals have stayed active. Now that first shot that we put out before that 10-inch rain, a lot of that disappeared real early. But since then, we've gotten kind of somewhat the right kind of rains to keep these herbicides active. So we're really, I think we're in better shape than I thought we were going to be as far as grass control in our rice crop. So, that's certainly a good thing. Let's keep these residuals active all the way to flood. Today, had one farmer put out command, another shot, actually his third shot of command, on several fields because that was his best option because of the lack of levees. Smelled prowl in the air, so I think people are taking this to heed and try to get residuals out in front of these rains and keep them active and keep this grass from coming up. So that's the big key. Then once grass starts coming up, we got to look at post-emerge options. Clincher is a choice, especially when the rice is too small for rice star or regiment. Small rice, like 1-2 leaf stuff. Clincher is a good option right there on small weeds. I've used some Rebel X this year where I'd, barnyard grass and some different broadleaf situations, and that's worked really well. That's got clincher and grasp in it. And then after that, we look at, rice star and regiment as good choices on the bigger barnyard grass. Once you go get into salvage situations, like a rice star regiment can be a good choice. Also a rice star and either beyond or postscript will be a good choice for us. So that's when we get into those salvage situations. Hopefully we won't have many of these, because certainly what I've seen this week has really been promising for me. One other weed I want to talk about real quickly is the annual sedges, white margin sedge and rice flat sedge. Loin's a great choice on these, but a lot of times we can't put loin out because it's nearby soybeans. Now we've got areas this year where there's no soybeans close by, so loin would be certainly a safer option in some of those cases. And Bassagran's also another very good choice for these sedges. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Where we've got planted, the crop is really shaping up surprisingly well. Of course, there's going to be a lot of rice unplanted this year. Probably the most I can ever remember being unplanted in this area. So we're going to have a lot of guys without rice and a lot of bare ground out there that we're going to be looking at this year. But hopefully things will shape up, and we can get beans planted, maybe get some late rice planted, and get this thing shaped up, and maybe end up with a better crop than we certainly expect at this time, I think. For more information, feel free to contact me through Farmers Supply Association. And this has been Randy Kulpechka with your Farmers Supply Association Agri Report.